Hey everyone, my name is Ian, you're watching Big Rock Media. Since 2004, Suzuki's V-Strom 650 has been a favorite among budget-conscious adventure riders who don't need to stray too far from the pavement or maybe easy dirt roads. In fact, I owned one of these bikes, an early bike, a 2004 model, for many years, and it was one of the favorite motorcycles that I've ever had. For 2017, the V-Strom 650 received its third major revision in its lifetime, and this 2021 model you see here has been unchanged since 2017, although they've changed the trim levels, the equipment levels, and we'll talk about that in a minute. In the last 15 years since this bike came out, the other manufacturers have really upped their game and brought out many exciting new adventure bikes and really revolutionized the segment. So the question is, with this bike soldiering on with the same basic design dating all the way back to 2004, can it stay relevant? Can it stay competitive? And what niche or what market segment does it occupy in today's adventure biking community? So before I go any further in the review, if you like my motorcycle content, if you like my reviews, please consider helping me create future content by doing a few things: subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell, leaving a comment, hitting a thumbs up, and consider supporting me on Patreon, as I do have some exclusive benefits for Patreon supporters. So in this review, I'm trying out a little bit of a shorter format than some of my last two motorcycle reviews, so please let me know what you prefer. Do you like the longer reviews? Do you like the shorter reviews? Let me know down below and I'll adapt my style going forward. So for 2021, the V-Strom 650 comes, at least in the United States, in three different trim levels. You've got the base bike, which comes in at $8,849. On that bike, you don't get the tubeless spoke wheels here, you get cast wheels, and you don't get all the extras you see here, the handguards, the engine bars, the engine protector, luggage, things like that. So it's a very base bike. After the base bike, you can move up to the XT model. The XT model is $9,349, and for that you add the engine deflector down here, this plastic piece, but not the crash bars. You get handguards, and you get the tubeless spoke wheels, which you see here on this bike. Now, if you move up to the XT Adventure, which is what you're seeing here, this bike retails for $10,449. And what this bike adds to the XT is the engine crash protection here, which I believe is actually made by SW Motec. And you also get the hard luggage, which you see here, which again, I actually believe Suzuki farms out to SW Motec, but they're actually really nice bags. The 650 V-Strom uses a 645cc 90-degree V-twin engine, liquid-cooled double overhead cam. It has roots going back all the way to the SV650 in the 1990s. They've kept the same basic design. The engine has low vibration because it has perfect primary balance with the cylinders being arranged at 90 degrees. It's mated to a 6-speed gearbox, which shifts actually very, very well. Suzuki's always been known for their really slick shifting gearboxes. This bike does not come with a lot of technology, and some of you will really like that. So it does have 2-level traction control, actually 3-level if off is one of the levels. It also has something called Suzuki's low RPM assist, which basically means before you take off, the engine RPM increases just slightly and it prevents you from stalling the bike as much and just gives you a smoother takeoff. So you notice that the RPMs increase a little bit if you pull the clutch lever in, even in the slightest. So let me run through a few details of the bike before we go out and go on a ride. So it has a 3-position adjustable windshield. It adjusts maybe, an inch up or down. I find that it buffets pretty badly, but it has the least buffeting for me at 5'11" in the low position. A lot of people swap the windshields out on V-Stroms. It's a very common thing. Looking here at the dashboard, I really like the dashboard on this bike much more than I did on the 1050 V-Strom, which I reviewed a few weeks ago. This bike has a nice big analog tachometer, and then it has a regular LCD screen to the right, which shows you some other information like trip computers, fuel mileage clock, things like that, traction control. So this motorcycle does have ABS brakes, but unfortunately they cannot be turned off and they do not have an off-road mode. We'll talk about that a little more when we go for a ride in the dirt. The fuel tank that you're looking at here is 5.3 gallons, and I get between 50 and 60 miles a gallon riding this bike, so it gives you a range of well over 200 miles, if not 250 miles, which is a great thing to have. Let's talk about the suspension just briefly. So the front suspension has around 6.3 inches of travel, which is definitely on the low end for an adventure bike. And the only adjustment that the front forks have is spring preload. You don't get any damping adjustments on the front fork. On the rear suspension, you do get a rebound damping adjustment and you get a remote preload adjustment, which is nice. If you want to load up a passenger, you can just spin that and increase your remote preload. For the braking on this bike, you're looking at dual 310mm rotors up front, squeezed by 2 piston calipers, not 4 piston calipers, so they're definitely budget brakes. And in the back, you have a 250mm rotor squeezed by a 2 piston caliper. The seat height on this bike is one of its good features. It's only 33.5 inches. The seat on this bike is not adjustable, so it does not have low and high positions. The ground clearance on the V-Strom 650 is one of its biggest challenges, and we'll talk about that in a dirt, but it only has around just over 6 inches of ground clearance. Ground clearance is one of this bike's biggest challenges, especially when you go off-road, and we'll talk about that when I ride in the dirt. But at only 6.7 inches of ground clearance, it just doesn't quite have enough clearance under there to make you feel confident going over rocks and ruts and things like that on the trail. So how much does the V-Strom 650 weigh, and how does that compare to its competition? Well, for a 650, it's about what you would expect for a twin-cylinder bike. So the base model is around 476 pounds. When you start to add all the stuff, bags, crash protectors, you know, the different things that this adventure model has, this bike comes in with fuel around 530 pounds. So it puts it in there in that category, although it's not the lightest bike, but it's also not the heaviest bike, if that makes sense. A few other things I want to point out on the bike before we go for our ride. The mirrors work really, really well. They've extended them out with these little extenders, and they work extremely well. I think they've been using the same mirrors for like 15 years. The handlebars are wide and comfortable and tall enough. The hand guards are actually, I was impressed with how sturdy they are. They're not too bad. They are just plastic, but they work pretty well, and I like having them. They really protect your hands well from the wind. The luggage, so I really like these aluminum bags. There's a couple things though I don't like about them, but let me talk about what I like first. So what I like is that they're well designed, they're stylish, and they seem very durable. They open and close really well. They come off and on the bike really easily. So if you're thinking of getting the adventure model, I think you'll be happy with the bags. Now personally, I don't use hard luggage on adventure bikes, and I'm going to have a video on my channel, if I already don't have a video published by the time this review goes live, about why I don't use hard luggage, but that's a subject for another day. But yeah, I do like these bags, but there are a couple concerns I have with them. One is that they're a little bit wider than the handlebars and the mirror. So when I'm lane splitting or lane filtering, it's a little nerve-wracking having these behind me, so I tend to take them off. The other concern I have is that Suzuki has chose to mount them above the exhaust pipe instead of making a cutout in the bag for the exhaust. So what that means is that the bags are mounted pretty high. The top of the bags are about 4 inches above the passenger seat here and above the rear rack. So it's going to push your weight a little bit higher. So I would suggest if you're loading these bags, try to keep your heavy objects here near the bottom because it's going to make the bike have a higher center of gravity than you otherwise would. So let's cover tire sizes real quick before we go out on our ride. So the front uses a 19-inch wheel wrapped in a 110 series width front tire, and the back is a 17-inch wheel with a 150 section width tire. So there's a good selection of dual sport tires in this size category because a lot of adventure bikes have this size of tires and wheels on their bike. So decent selection there. The stock tires are the Bridgestone A41s, which I believe were the same tires I had on the 1050 XT, and they're also the same tires that came stock on my 1250 GS. So with all the specs and details out of the way, now it's time for us to gear up and go out for a ride. After the ride, we're going to come back here, we're going to talk about what I like, what I don't like, some suggested changes that they could make, how I think it compares to the competition, and then we'll have final thoughts. So stay tuned, let's go for a ride. Okay, riding the V-Strom 650. So we'll start with some twisty roads, a little bit of highway, and then we'll take a nice dirt road to kind of show you how the bike handles off-road, what its limitations are, how the traction control and ABS work, things like that. One of the first things that you notice when you start riding this bike is, well, it's easy to ride. The power is very approachable. See, that's full throttle right there. It's pretty easy to manage. The bike also has very intuitive quick handling. So basically you just think about going around a corner like this and it goes around the corner. It doesn't take much input through the bars to make that happen. One of the other things you notice is that the suspension does feel a bit budget. You know, you kind of feel the bumps quite a bit, and the valving doesn't feel very advanced. Also, you have a lot of wind buffeting, which you can probably hear through the helmet audio coming off the screen, so I apologize for that. The brakes, if you're used to really modern high performance bikes, the brakes are going to feel kind of mushy. but if you're used to a KLR 650, the brakes are going to feel good. So that's all a relative thing. But you can have a lot of fun with this bike on these twisty roads, and I definitely do. Like, it's fun to do this all day on. One strange thing I notice about this V-Strom, and I don't remember the old V-Strom 650 being like this, is that the handlebars feel kind of far forward. Like, I kind of want to sit here with my hands like this, but I have to lean forward to get to the bars. So it forces me into more of a, almost a little bit more of a sport touring kind of a position. And I'm not sure how I feel about that. The legroom here is not great. I feel like my knees are really high up in the air, and like my legs just don't have quite enough room. So that's something to keep in mind. Maybe that's partially what they did by, you know, lowering the seat height, is you compromise some legroom there, but it made it friendly for shorter riders. Other thing is this engine. I mean, unless you look at the tachometer, I mean, the engine's quiet and it doesn't hardly have any vibration. So I can be riding here at 7,000 RPM, 8,000 RPM, and I just don't feel, look at that, I just don't feel vibration through the bars, because on a 90-degree V-twin engine it has perfect balance, so they tend to be very smooth. This engine is just very engaging, very fun to ride. It could use more sound, and these V-Stroms sound really good with a slip-on pipe on them, so if you're thinking about getting one, you might want to budget for that if you like sound. I like this dashboard, the very clear speedometer, gear indicator. These ones here are a little bit smaller, like the air temperature clock, traction control, but they're fine, they work well. And I like this big tachometer. That's very, very nice. So I want to show you here something called the low RPM assist. So you see how the bike, when I let the clutch out a little bit, see how it raises the RPM just a little bit? What that does is it helps you take off smoother. Come on, little bike. Oh, that's fun. Like, it's not fast, but it's fun to do this. And I bet you this bike would be a lot more fun with an exhaust. It was like third gear at like 75 miles an hour. Shows you how smooth this engine is. Let's go for an overtake here on this one. So there was the red line on the bike, about 10,000. See, the bike has plenty of power, especially for one person. You can probably hear the wind buffeting now that we're at highway speeds. You know, some helmets are worse than others. Buffeting's relative, but I think a lot of people are going to have a problem with the wind buffeting from this windshield. Starting to get just a couple little raindrops here. Hope we don't get too much rain, because it's kind of hard to shoot videos in the rain. So at 65 miles an hour, we're about 4,800 RPM. So the RPMs, you know, the bike is geared a little bit low, but I mean, you have to consider it's a small engine, and again, you don't feel any vibration at those higher RPMs. So cruising on the highway is no problem for this bike. How do the brakes feel? Well, let me show you here. Get past this car so they don't freak out. So that was a full panic stop there. The suspension is soft, so it, you know, dives a lot. The brakes, I mean, they work, but they're not great. They have kind of a mushy feel, like I talked about, but they're only 2 piston calipers in the front. But as an all-around street bike, you know, just for the price, this thing is really hard to beat. It's smooth, it's fun, it's comfortable. The seat also, I don't know if I mentioned this, but the seat's very comfortable on this bike. Much more so than the one on the 1050. I don't know, they did a weird design on that 1050 seat, and we were having kind of some conversation about that in the comments on that video. But yeah, I don't know, it wasn't the greatest seat on the 1050, but the 650 seat is a lot more plush, so I like that. So just cruising here through the valley. Like, I have to watch my speed because they do patrol this, but I mean 70, 75, 80, this bike is very comfortable to cruise on the highway all day. Okay, we're getting ready to make our turn here onto this Forest Service dirt road. Get past this trash truck, don't get killed. Okay. So let's pull over here for a second and talk about the settings. Alright, so for the settings, when you go in the dirt on the V-Strom, there's not much you can do. Again, you can't turn the ABS off. There's nothing to do with the suspension, obviously. What you do have is traction control. So what I'll do is I'll hit the select button here on the dash and go into TC1. You can turn it off and then it gives you this TC light, but I'm going to try TC1 and show you how it is. I'll show you how it is with it off as well. So not much else to do. So this road, we go through a little bit of a kind of a slightly sandy area, and then we go up this ridge here, and it has some nice like dips and water bars where I can show you the limitations of this. So let me show you the traction control, how it works on this. So this is TC1, so let me go full throttle here in first gear. So see, it doesn't let you slide the bike around at all. Again, that's fully open throttle, so if you want to like try to slide through a turn, nope, that's not going to happen. Now of course you can turn that off. So if I turn it off, then oh yeah, then I can do whatever I want. But then you're going to have to learn how to control that really well. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that back on. Now I have to close the throttle. Okay, TC1, there we go. So that's full open throttle. So you can see one of my complaints with the V-Strom, you see how the bars are doing this? Like if I hit any soft soil at all, it just wants to tuck its front end in and really is very unnerving. So see, I'll drive through this sand here. It just doesn't have good suspension geometry for sand and things like that. Okay, now we're going to start to go up this hill, and I'll show you the limitations of the suspension here. So I can already feel like it's really harsh. You know, it's like it doesn't absorb the terrain very well. But with that being said, I'm still able to go at a pretty decent pace here, you know, within the limits of physics, of course. I'm not trying to break it. I will say it does an okay job for only having 6 inches of travel. You know, I have to give it some credit for that. But you can probably see and hear how harsh this ride is. It does not give you a plush ride at all. See it here? See, I'm using all the travel of the suspension to be able to do this. So having traction control on, it really helps when you have street tires like this, because you know, it's just more controllable. So I had to leave it on for the most part. There's the rear bottoming out, and I don't even have the hard bags on right now. Oh, that was a big hit. I had to stand up for that, otherwise I feel like I'm going to break something. But if you don't be a gorilla like me and you just ride a little bit more relaxed, you know, it's not too bad. You can cruise roads like this and you can get by. It's just not meant to be ridden aggressively. It doesn't have the chassis or the suspension for that kind of a thing. So this is probably the kind of road that you're going to take your V-Strom 650 on. It's more of a forest road, a fire road, whatever you want to call it. It has embedded rocks and it has bumps and ruts, but it's nothing crazy. It's nothing that you need a dirt bike for. You just have to watch the larger impacts. I do wish that we could turn ABS off, because then it would allow me to slide into corners with the brakes. But you can't do that with the V-Strom. Now, if this was my personal bike, what I would do would be try to wire in some sort of a switch to manually shut that off. So the position for standing is not that great. Like, it doesn't feel natural to stand up on this. The bars feel in a very awkward position, like way too low. The foot pegs are rubber, and they don't have, you can't take the rubber off. Like, there's no serration underneath like some bikes. So one thing I have not demonstrated, which I should demonstrate for you guys, is how this ABS works off-road. So first, let me show you the rear brake. So let me come in here. That's full rear brake, and that's all the slowdown that I get. So it takes forever. The front brake, try not to crash here, but see, it'll pulse. It actually stops you pretty good with ABS on the front brake. A lot of people think ABS is bad off-road. That's not true. It's really helpful on the front. So yeah, you can see this here is a limitation for the V-Strom. Well, two things: the suspension, which we're just using all of the travel, and it's very harsh. The other thing is this here. It's so close to just, you know, tearing this off down here. So I'm always very mindful of that, and there's just no protection underneath. But you know what? For sort of the underdog, small, affordable adventure bike, this thing does really, really well, and it's actually still pretty fun to ride. So if you keep your expectations within check, and you're just riding on kind of roads like this, and you don't need to go crazy and pretend you're a rally racer and keep up with your buddies on their KTM, you know, 890 rallies, then really enjoyed riding it. So let's go ahead and head back home and get into what I like, what I don't like, some final thoughts, and talk about the competition. So thanks for riding along. So there's a lot to really like about the V-Strom 650. Probably my favorite thing is this little engine. The engine is just a gem. I mean, it's so smooth, it's so fun to ride, it revs really well, it's linear power, there's no vibration, and I just really like these L-twin engines that Suzuki has. The next thing I really like about this bike is that it's very easy to ride. It's easy handling. The power is smooth and soft and approachable. The handling is easy and nimble, whether you're on-road or off-road. It's never intimidating to ride. It doesn't scare you, and I think for newer riders it's a great bike, but also a lot of experienced riders will appreciate it just because there's no drama, and it's comfortable, and it's a good bike for doing long trips on. The next thing I like is that the seat height is pretty approachable. So around 33.5 inches, it's quite a bit lower than some of the other adventure bikes out there. Although it is higher than like a cruiser bike or some of the entry-level bikes that some beginner riders like to use, I think if you're getting into adventure bikes, at least it's not crazy tall like some of the European offerings are. Next thing I really like about this bike, and you don't get this on the base model, but I like these wheels. I think they look great in this gold color. I like the tubeless spoke design. I think that's really a benefit, not having to worry about carrying tubes with you and being able to easily repair a puncture. And the spoke design gives you more capability for off-roading instead of, you know, bending a cast wheel. So I like that. I also like the dashboard and the controls on the bike. They're easy to use, they're easy to read. Unlike a lot of bikes nowadays that are so complicated, and some bikes now have these LCD dashboards. I mean, I mentioned this on the V-Strom 1050. I really hated the dashboard on that bike. It was a reverse LCD, way too much information crammed in this little thing. I feel like either stick to an analog setup like this with a small LCD with some small information on the side, or just go all the way to a color TFT, but don't give us those in-between options. So I like that they stuck with the more traditional dashboard on this. So what are the things I don't like about the V-Strom 650? So there's a few things. My number one complaint has to do with really kind of the suspension and the ground clearance and how vulnerable the engine is. So I feel like the overall chassis and the performance and the character of the bike lends itself pretty well to exploring off-road. And I think a lot of people are looking for an affordable adventure bike. I mean, $10,000 with bags and crash protectors is a great deal. But what holds back the V-Strom is the limited suspension travel at 6 inches means the suspension bottoms out pretty easily, pretty quickly over rough terrain. So you can't ride too fast before you start hitting up against those suspension bump stops. The other thing is that the ground clearance is just not enough. So, you know, once you sit on the bike, I mean, it already starts off with such low ground clearance. but the exhaust and the oil filter and everything is right down there underneath. There's no protection for it. You can get an aftermarket skid plate. This factory plastic thing does not protect underneath. It's just a side cosmetic piece, so don't think that's a skid plate. But I'm always worried about breaking something down there when I'm off-roading. I took this bike on some pretty serious, you know, honestly like dual sport type rides with my riding buddies. And they were pretty amazed that I was keeping up, especially with these street tires. But I did have to be careful not to break something. And I just kept thinking, you know, please don't break this bike. Now, I know a lot of V-Strom owners will say, oh, you know what, I've, you know, put 30,000 miles on, never had a problem. But it just depends on the kind of terrain you're going on. The other thing I wish they would have done is given you some sort of a off-road mode or just an off switch altogether for the analog brakes. So I'd really like to be able to turn the ABS off to get a little bit more control of my brakes off-road. I found that when I was riding in the dirt and some really slippery, like sandy situations, steep hills, loose rocks, that it was a little bit sketchy at times just going down a steep hill and not really having much braking control because the ABS would just intervene. You can still use the front brake, and the ABS, usually you don't want to turn it off on the front, but it was just a little sketchy not being able to turn that off. And the best thing would be to have an off-road mode, like a lot of bikes do, where you can turn off the rear ABS and leave on the front. How does this compare to bikes in a similar price range or similar displacement? First of all, let me get this out of the way. Do I like the 1050 V-Strom or the 650 V-Strom better? Well, absolutely, hands down, this one. I have never been a huge fan of the larger V-Stroms. Ever since they came out back in 2003 or 2002, whenever that 1000 came out, I never really loved that bike. It just felt like it was too much engine for the rest of the chassis, the brakes, suspension, and everything else. When they brought the 650 out in 04 and I rode it, I was like, yes, this is perfect. This is exactly what I wanted, and I ended up buying one. And I think the same thing is still true today. I still prefer the 650. There's something about the bigger V-Strom that just doesn't feel quite right to me. And I appreciate what it is. And I think if you're a larger, heavier rider or you carry passengers a lot, you're gonna need that additional power, that additional torque, that additional carrying capability of that larger bike. But I think for most people riding on their own, and especially if you want to go off-road, because this bike is so much easier to ride, so much better balanced off-road than the 1050, so much less intimidating as well with less power. So what about the Versys 650? Well, yeah, I've ridden the Versys 650 quite a bit. I love that bike. I think it handles better on the street than this bike. The Versys has a 17-inch front wheel, so it's a more street-oriented. It doesn't have the off-road abilities and sort of the capabilities that this bike has, but some people do still use the Versys off-road, but in my opinion, you're better off with the V-Strom if you're gonna do that. The engine is better on this for sure. The V-twin engine has much more character, it's smoother, it sounds better, especially with an exhaust. These sound great with an exhaust. The Versys, the little parallel twin 650, just is very uninspiring. It sounds like a vacuum cleaner. Although it's a great bike, nothing wrong with it. But if it was me, I tend to be more of a V-Strom person. What about Honda CB500X? So that's a good question. So I've ridden the CB500X and I really appreciate that bike. I think it's great, but it doesn't have the punch of this. It doesn't have the grunt because it's a smaller engine. It feels like a more compact bike. I do like it, and it's a very good value at the price that Honda sells those for. But I think for touring, you're going to be better served by this bike. It tends to carry luggage better. I think it's a bit more comfortable, a bit more spacious ergonomics. And overall, yeah, I think touring riders are going to prefer the 650 more, and you're going to appreciate this additional power and the little bit additional smoothness of this V-twin engine compared to the 500cc parallel twin on the CB500X. So now I know the bike that you're all thinking of, and I haven't mentioned yet, is Yamaha's Tenere 700. Well, the Tenere 700 is an off-road machine, and this is not. So they're designed to do two different things. You know, this is an older platform that is designed more for touring riders, for riders who do a little bit of dirt and gravel roads, but are not aggressively riding off-road. The Tenere 700 is a newer design. It's got long travel suspension. It's a taller bike. Again, the Tenere 700 is designed to go aggressively off-road and compete with bikes like KTM 790 Adventure. This is not. This is a touring-oriented, you know, street bike that can do some light off-roading. This is going to be more comfortable. The stock seat on this is more comfortable than the Tenere. But overall, I do think that Tenere 700 is a very, very tough competitor for this, considering that that's a $10,000 bike. And this, at least with the bags and the stuff you see here, is over $10,000. So I think that's a tough nut to crack, and I think a lot of people are going to gravitate towards that Yamaha if they want to do more off-road riding. I think it's great that Suzuki is continuing to put out a basic, wonderful, all-around, well-balanced, affordable, approachable, easy to ride, low seat height adventure bike for the masses. And I really think that's what the V-Strom 650 represents. It's an alternative to bikes like the Tenere 700 or the 790 or other hard charging off-road rally oriented bikes, because the fact remains that most adventure bike buyers don't go off-road. They don't need that capability. And so they might be better served by a more comfortable, approachable, easier to ride bike like the V-Strom. I want to thank Suzuki USA for lending me this bike for the past few weeks to evaluate. I really appreciate your partnership. I also want to thank all my viewers for just continuing your support and just loyally watching my videos. I really appreciate you guys and girls out there. If you found this video useful, if you want to support future content creation like this with motorcycles, please, again, hit the subscribe button and hit the bell, leave a thumbs up, leave a comment, and consider supporting me on Patreon if you want to, again, support future motorcycle content creation on this channel. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Ride safe, drive safe. Until next time, we'll see you out on the trail.